There is a type of person who does everything right. They wake up early, pray, read the Bible, go to church, serve, help, avoid error whenever possible. From the outside, there is no reason for doubt. This person seems firm, committed, consistent. Someone who takes faith seriously. But the conflict begins early. Because, even with everything in order, something does not fit. It is not rebellion. It is not hidden sin. It is not lack of effort. It is a discreet sense of distance. A calm, but persistent emptiness. As if the relationship were active, yet without life. The words keep leaving the mouth, but no longer produce encounter. The gestures remain correct, but no longer generate presence. And this is confusing, because if I am doing everything right, why does it feel like God is far away? This question is almost never spoken, not because of unbelief, but because of fear. Fear of seeming weak. Fear of seeming ungrateful. Fear of admitting something that does not match the image we sustain. So the answer usually becomes doing more. More involvement. More discipline. More activity. In the silent hope that, at some point, the feeling returns. But perhaps the problem is not lack of effort. Perhaps it is something else. Activity can keep faith busy, but not necessarily alive. This tension does not appear in those who abandon faith. It arises precisely in those who remain, in those who care, in those who try. People who do not want to quit, but also cannot ignore the internal distance. Maybe the right question is not what else do I still need to do? Maybe it is a more uncomfortable question, and more revealing. It is from there that this conversation truly begins. The Bible never treated religious activity as a synonym for intimacy. In fact, it insists on separating these two things very clearly. From the earliest texts, an uncomfortable pattern appears. People deeply involved in spiritual practices, yet disconnected from the relationship those practices were meant to sustain. It is not neglect. It is not abandonment. It is intense involvement, misplaced. Prophets denounce sacrifices, feasts, fasts, songs, and vows. And this causes strangeness, because all these practices were, at some point, commanded by God Himself. The problem was never what was being done. It was what those things came to occupy. Instead of being means of encounter, they became guarantees of safety. Instead of pointing to God, they began to function as substitutes for Him. The people continued going to the temple, continued following rules, continued speaking the name of God with reverence. Externally, everything looked healthy. Internally, something was already broken. God then responds directly, "This is not what I asked for." Not because the practices were wrong, but because they were being used to avoid something deeper. The Bible shows that it is possible to maintain an active religious life without ever allowing oneself to be reached. It is possible to obey rules and resist transformation. It is possible to speak about God without truly hearing Him. This pattern does not appear only in corrupt leaders or negative figures. It emerges in sincere people, committed people, people who truly believed they were doing the right thing. The error is not in the practice itself. It is in the silent exchange that happens over time. When practice becomes a shield. When ritual protects from confrontation. When routine prevents silence. That is why the biblical text insists so much on terms like heart, hear, return, remain. Because there is a clear difference between fulfilling something and being present. The biblical critique was never, stop doing. It was always, do not use doing to occupy the place of relationship. The problem is not doing too much. It is doing in the wrong place. When activity takes the center, intimacy becomes optional. And the more the person gets involved, the harder it becomes to perceive the distance. Because everything keeps functioning. The schedule is full. The reputation is intact. The discourse remains correct. Only the relationship grows distant. This pattern runs through the entire Bible because it runs through the entire human experience. And that is precisely why it remains so current and so difficult to recognize. There is a deep and rarely spoken reason why religious activity is so attractive. Activity gives a sense of control. It organizes time, defines goals, creates the impression of progress. You know what to do, when to do it, and how to measure whether you did it right. Intimacy does not work that way. It does not organize easily. It does not respond well to checklists. It does not offer clear metrics of progress. And that is exactly why so many people prefer tasks over relationship. The human mind seeks predictability, seeks security, seeks structures that reduce emotional risk. Activities do this very well. They occupy space, fill silence, give the sense that something is being built. But intimacy requires another posture. It requires exposure. It requires presence without guarantees. It requires remaining even when there is no clear sense of return. In practice, this is uncomfortable. In silence, questions arise that routine usually muffles. Doubts that do not appear when the schedule is full. Insecurities that do not manifest while there is something to do. Activity often functions as anesthesia. It reduces contact with these deeper layers. Not because they are forbidden, but because they are difficult to sustain. When a person is always spiritually busy, they rarely need to stop and perceive themselves. They do not need to deal with emptiness. They do not need to face their own fragility. They do not need to admit that certain answers did not come. Activity creates safe distance. Intimacy removes that protection. That is why tasks are preferred. They keep the person active without necessarily making them vulnerable. This is not an exclusive problem of faith. The same dynamic appears in human relationships. It is easier to do things for someone than to truly be present. It is more comfortable to fulfill roles than to allow oneself to be known. In spirituality, this intensifies. Because silence before God cannot be controlled, cannot be accelerated, cannot be forced. And this confronts the illusion of control that activity offers. Activity occupies. Intimacy confronts. When faith is organized only in tasks, it becomes predictable but shallow, functional but distant. Everything seems right on the outside, while inside something remains untouched. This pattern is not born from bad intention. It is born from fear, conscious or not, of remaining without defenses before what is real. And the more activity grows, the harder it becomes to perceive what is being avoided. Because being busy always seems better than being exposed. And that is exactly where the conflict begins to form. There is a cost that is almost never perceived at the beginning. When activity grows, everything seems to work. The routine is full. The practices are up to date. The feeling is commitment. But little by little, something begins to change. Inside, the tiredness is not physical. It is internal. It is a type of exhaustion that does not improve with rest. The person keeps doing, but no longer knows exactly why. This is the first sign of emptiness. When activity is not born from intimacy, it begins to demand energy that gives nothing back in return. The result is not immediate collapse. It is slow wear. Faith becomes weight. What once sustained now consumes. And almost no one talks about this. Because, on the outside, everything seems correct. No one suspects. Sometimes, not even the person themselves. Then a silent frustration emerges. It is not revolt. It is not open disbelief. It is a constant sense that something is not complete. The person wonders why they no longer feel anything. Why practices no longer produce the same effect. Why emptiness remains even with so much dedication. And instead of questioning the model, they question themselves. Guilt enters the scene. Maybe I am failing. Maybe my faith is weak. Maybe the problem is me. This guilt is heavy because it has no face. It does not point to a clear error. It simply settles in. And the more the person does to compensate, the more distant they feel. The more you do, the more distant you may feel. At this point, spirituality becomes an effort to recover something that no longer responds. And this deepens the exhaustion. Because there is no practice sufficient to replace intimacy. There is only repetition. Before continuing, let me take a quick pause. If this content is making sense to you, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps the video reach more people who live this same weariness, but almost never talk about it. Now, returning. Emptiness does not happen because the person stopped. It happens because they continued, without space for presence, without space for silence, without space to be honest with themselves. Everything becomes obligation, even what should have been encounter. And when faith becomes only maintenance, it loses the ability to nourish. The hardest part is perceiving this while still inside the cycle, because abandoning activity seems wrong. Slowing down seems like guilt. Questioning the model feels like threat. So the person continues, tired, empty, and silently wondering why all this no longer fills. This is the invisible cost, and it does not appear all at once. It accumulates until emptiness can no longer be ignored. There is a silent temptation when we perceive emptiness, the urge to fix it quickly. Seek a new practice. Adjust the routine. Add more effort. But intimacy does not respond to force. It is not born from pressure. It is formed through learning. And learning intimacy requires something activity usually avoids: time without control. That is why repositioning does not begin with what you do, but with how you are. It is not about abandoning practices. It is about removing from them the role they should never have had. Practices are not automatic bridges. They are possible spaces. But they only work when they do not replace presence. The Bible never offered formulas to feel God. It offered paths to remain. And remaining is different from producing results. It is accepting that not every day will have clarity, that not every moment will bring answers, that not every season will be emotionally rewarding. Intimacy is learned when a person stops negotiating with God and begins to stand before Him, without argument, without performance, without trying to cause effect. This is uncomfortable because it removes the ground of functional religiosity, the kind that measures everything by return. But that is exactly where something changes. When a person allows silence without trying to fill it immediately. When they accept their own limitation without translating it as spiritual failure. When they understand that presence is not feeling, it is posture. This repositioning does not solve everything. It does not eliminate emptiness all at once. It does not turn faith into something easy. But it changes the axis. Faith stops revolving around what is felt and begins to be sustained by what is trusted. This does not generate euphoria. It generates stability. And stability is something rare in religious environments that live on constant stimulation. That is why this path is not popular. It does not produce ready-made phrases. It does not generate applause. But it builds something deeper. A faith that does not depend on always functioning well. A relationship not based on performance. A spirituality that endures time. Perhaps the most honest point is this: intimacy is not demanded. It is learned slowly, with failures, with pauses, with silence, and sometimes with emptiness. Emptiness, in this sense, is not an immediate enemy. It can be a space for adjustment, an invitation to maturity, not to do less or more, but to be different. And here there is no room for a closed conclusion, because this is not a ready answer. It is an ongoing reflection. But there is a sentence that reorganizes all of this with simple clarity. God never asked for performance. He asked for presence. Perhaps that is the question that remains. Not what you are doing, but how you are present in what you do. The rest is learned with time.